Metal Gear Solid, widely known as one of the best games ever released for the Sony PlayStation, and the one game in this series that I cannot bring myself to enjoy. I've tried to play the original Metal Gear Solid twice. The first time I made it to Sniper Wolf, and the second time I only made it to the tank battle before packing it in again. But why did I fall off MGS1 so quickly? I played the other games and loved them, so what's different about the first entry? I think it comes down to the changes made between MGS1 and 2. MGS2 made a few key changes that made the gameplay a lot smoother and, to me, a more enjoyable experience. The first one being the inclusion of the M9, a tranquilizer pistol. When I play stealth games, I like to try and play it as close to non-lethal as I can, because what's the point in stealth if I just kill all the enemies? I might as well play an action game. In the original MGS, there is no truly non-lethal option that I'm aware of. I can melee guards, but they get up after a short time, and normally the first hit will trigger an alert phase, and the only gun I have with a silencer is the SOCOM. The second inclusion is first-person aiming. I always find myself blindly firing into the distance in MGS1 when I decide to use the weapons. There's no way to properly aim your guns, and try to face exactly where the enemy is standing and just hoping you hit them is not a reliable way to deal damage. MGS2 added in the ability to aim in first person, which allows me to more precisely place my shots, and it makes each bullet feel more intentional. So how does someone like me get into Metal Gear Solid 1? I don't like playing the original, but I'm still interested in experiencing the first 3D outing of Solid Snake. Well, in 2004, on Nintendo's little lunchbox, the GameCube, Silicon Knights, with the blessing of Kojima, developed a remake of MGS1 in the MGS2 engine, and brought all of these changes across to Shadow Moses Island. Let's talk about the Twin Snakes. Twin Snakes is a curious beast. It's a remake of one of the most highly acclaimed games ever made, and yet it doesn't receive nearly as much attention as the original. Why is that? One of the reasons is its exclusivity. It's only on GameCube. It's never been re-released or ported to other consoles, it's just been left in the past to gather dust, similar to MGS4. The difference between this game and 4 though is the price. I paid £10 for my copy of MGS4, while a copy of the Twin Snakes set me back £68. That's nearly the same price as a brand new PS5 game. But was it worth it? In my eyes, absolutely. With this game now in my possession, I can enjoy the majesty of sneaking through Shadow Moses Island and stopping Liquid Snake, meeting Meryl and having to change controller port to beat Psycho Mantis. I would never call this an entry point to the series, I'd recommend 3 for that. But once you find yourself getting comfortable and you maybe don't like how restrictive MGS1 feels by comparison to what came afterwards, this is a pretty good way to experience it. I know a lot of people say that the voice acting is worse and some of the cutscenes are a bit ridiculous with Snake flipping all over the place and dodging bullets, but is it really that ridiculous compared to a literal vampire, a guy who controls bees, and 2 old men beating the shit out of one another on top of a submarine? I don't think so. Actually, it gave the game a weird charm, kinda like how people describe the cheesy dialogue in Resident Evil 4. Fucking hell, I'm never escaping this game, am I? I found myself dying of laughter when these moments showed up, because, come on, how is this not funny? Plus, it's not completely unfounded that Snake would do stuff like this. Even back in the original, he flipped out of the way to avoid a tank shell. As a graphical upgrade, this remake is leaps and bounds ahead of the 1998 classic. MGS2 was a massive step up from the blocky models of the original, and the same applies for the Twin Snakes. It's such a shame then that the majority of my time was spent staring at the top right corner. The Soliton radar is a vital yet distracting aspect of the HUD. You need to use it in order to know the positions of enemy guards and where they're looking, but the amount you need to rely on it means that you practically never take your eyes off of it. This is a shame, as there are so many beautifully crafted environments and small details are abundant, but the player will likely not notice it 99% of the time. Story here is the same as the original, and I found it rather gripping. The plot starts off simple and slowly gets more complex as the story goes on. The basic plot is that a group of mercenaries called Foxhound has taken control of a nuclear disposal facility on Shadow Moses Island and are threatening to launch a nuclear strike using a new weapon called a Metal Gear. Snake's job is to sneak into the facility, take out the terrorists, and either deactivate or destroy Metal Gear. This basic plot allows us to have a lot of moments dedicated to characters similar to MGS3 compared to the theme-heavy approach of MGS2. Each member of Foxhound gets a distinct role, and they all get enough depth that their deaths are somewhat meaningful. This works a lot better than the members of Dead Cell, who hardly had any character at all, and were very one note. Sniper Wolf, Psycho Mantis, Vulcan Raven, Liquid Snake, and Revolver Ocelot all have distinct character. Mantis torments you by reading your memory card and moving your controller with his mind, which is still a really cool use of the vibration motors and controllers. Vulcan Raven is a brute in terms of his design, but his personality contrasts this with him being a really spiritual guy. Sniper Wolf is extremely patient and deadly after being saved by Big Boss as a child. Revolver Ocelot probably is the least development of everyone here, but ironically will be one of the most developed as the games go on. And finally, Liquid Snake is the brains behind the whole operation and is one of the titular twin snakes, along with Solid. He is a schemer and the mastermind keeping the other members of Foxhound in line, and also disguises himself as Master Miller to play havoc with Snake's support team. Speaking of Snake, this is the game that I think absolutely nails how to write his character. As I said in my MGS3 video, Solid Snake ran into what I call the Superman problem. In MGS2 he was a little too on top of things and cool to the point where he became somewhat boring as a character. In this game we are further back in the timeline, and therefore Snake still has some character development to do. These character moments do have a tendency to drag a little and end up discussing ideas of love and personal identity at really inopportune moments. A moment like this that particularly stood out to me was Meryl rambling about what she went through while Snake was saving the world, and all I could think was, could this not wait until we've escaped the bombing run that's going on right now? It was one of the few times that a character moment completely took me out of the story just due to the moment at which it was delivered. Coming back to Snake, his main arc is actually learning to care about the missions he partakes in and not treating them like a job. The main theme of the game is summed up as Gene, and don't get me wrong, this certainly is the more prominent arc, but I prefer Snake's own personal journey as he questions why he follows orders, and it leads on perfectly into MGS2, where Snake is telling Raiden that he needs to live for himself and pass on his subjective experience to the next generation. This is basically the lesson that Snake learns in this game, to embrace his own experience and not just to go with whatever others tell him to feel or think. This arc is performed beautifully, for the most part.
Gray Fox!
With David Hayter returning as Solid Snake. The voice acting in Twin Snakes is pretty solid, haha, with no performances that I thought were ridiculous or unbelievable. And that's saying a lot given just how much voice acting there is. The game comes on 2 of the GameCube's mini DVDs, each of which holds 1.46 gigabytes worth of data. The original also came on 2 discs, but those were PS1 CDs, which by comparison hold 700 megabytes. So that shows you just how much of an upgrade this game is in every aspect, with audio probably taking up a good amount of that space, as it's way higher quality than the PS1 game. Take a listen for yourself.
The nuclear weapons disposal facility on Shadow Moses Island in Alaska's Fox Archipelago was attacked and captured by Next Generation Special Forces, being led by members of Foxhound. The nuclear weapons disposal facility on Shadow Moses Island in Alaska's Fox Archipelago was attacked and captured by Next Generation Special Forces, being led by members of Foxhound.
On the subject of audio, let's talk about the soundtrack. Now generally the soundtrack for this series is pretty good. It ranges from iconic to above average, but I must be honest, this is the one area where I think the original is better, which is why I've been using that for my background music instead of the Twin Snakes versions. Even the songs that are brought over directly from the original have been changed and don't feel as impactful. The main problem with the soundtrack I have is the Game Over song. It's been made way less dramatic and it's quite subdued, and it doesn't go nearly as hard as the original did. A lot of the songs have been moved around as well, like The Best Is Yet To Come only plays during the end credits and not during the opening, which changes the atmosphere of the whole scene from unsettling as we don't know who Snake is or what awaits us to just generically sneaky. Still works, but I think the original scene worked more in the game's favour, and it's a shame to see this aspect not carried across into the Twin Snakes. In terms of playing Twin Snakes, it essentially feels like playing MGS2, but with the level design and plot of MGS1. Everything I spoke about in my MGS2 video to do with playing the game applies here. Snake has a good momentum when moving, and aiming in first person feels buttery smooth. I've already spoken about how this addition adds to the gameplay, but one addition I didn't talk about was the addition of a close range non-lethal option. You can walk up behind enemies and use the interact button to grab them, and if you keep pressing, you can choke them out. I didn't realise this until way late into my playthrough when I had to find Meryl before heading into the Mantis fight, and the only way to make her run to the bathroom that I could figure out after beating her up several times was trying to choke her out. I promise I'm not a psychopath. Blame Kojima. There's a few cool details as well that I absolutely love. The main one being that you need to find Meryl's codec frequency on the back of the physical case you get the game in. This was true for the original too, and I'm glad they kept it in, even though nowadays this twist works about as well as the fake crash in Arkham Asylum, because it's so incredibly well known as a piece of gaming trivia. The same is true for the twist to do with the Psycho Mantis fight, in which he moves your controller with the power of his mind, which means he vibrates it and it moves, or the fact that you read your memory card. This actually triggered some interesting lines in my playthrough, as I had some games on my card that triggered extra lines, and I'll talk about the last twist in just a moment, but first I want to talk about some of the other boss fights. These are probably the most well done in the series. If the end in 3 can be considered the best the series has to offer, then these are certainly some contenders for second place. In terms of gameplay mechanics, these feel the most suited to the game, rather than a lot of the bosses feeling like they're at odds with the core gameplay. The bosses feel like they escalate as they go on, rather than the odd dips and climbs of some of the following games. Revolver Ocelot is a super easy fight that just involves moving and shooting, both tasks the player would have performed a few times up to this point. It's an encounter within the first hour and a half of the gameplay, so this makes sense. It's a good introduction to boss fights and a capstone on the learning period of the game. From here on out, we are well and truly out of the tutorial. The tank fight is probably the weakest out of them all. The tank is big, bulky, can hit you super hard with shells or slowly chip away at you with the machine gun, and it has the least character out of every boss because despite being introduced with Vulcan Raven, we just fight against normal grunt enemies, which isn't very satisfying. The fight does have a purpose of getting the player to use weapons they maybe haven't up to this point, namely the different kinds of grenades. The third fight is again another test of using different weapons. This time we go up against Grey Fox and fight him hand to hand. This is important for the player to learn now, as the final fight is a fist fight against Liquid, and if the player hasn't learned how to fight before that, it could come off really jarring. The hand-to-hand combat is probably the weakest aspect of fighting, since we only have a 3-hit combo that occasionally has a dodgy hitbox. You need to be practically standing on top of your target to hit them, which leads to taking some damage that could be otherwise avoided. Next fight is Mantis, which I think I've talked about more than I've talked about any other boss in the series, but he just has so much going on. To take on him and his mind-reading abilities, we need to take our controller out of the first port and put it into the fourth on the GameCube so that he can't read our mind anymore, allowing us to damage him. At a few points he takes control of Meryl, who we need to knock out before we can hurt Mantis again. He will also pretend to change the channel on the TV, turn the screen black for a few seconds at a time. This is probably a contender for the best fight in the series, and it's a damn good opportunity to fuck around with the player and make them uncomfortable. Sniper Wolf 1 follows this, and it brings up one of my big complaints with MGS1 as a whole. Backtracking. Meryl gets shot from the opposite end of a long hallway by Sniper Wolf, and the only way to take her on is to get a sniper rifle of our own. We need to backtrack all the way to near the start of the game in order to obtain one and then come all the way back. Enemies are barely remixed and nothing interesting is done with this backtracking and seems to be there just a pad for time. This does happen later on too with the PAL key, but I used the additional skip for that added into the Twin Snakes, so it wasn't that bad. The actual fight with Sniper Wolf after obtaining the rifle is fine. She moves between different bits of cover and we just have to follow and shoot her. The only thing I could complain about is that your aim is thrown so far off course if you get hit during the fight that it's kinda ridiculous and just led to me taking more damage as I tried to bring my aim back, but then when I took more damage my aim would be thrown off even more. It can be a vicious cycle if you end up stuck in it. The Hind D comes next and is maybe the second weakest after the tank. It moves really fast and can occasionally be hard to track as the Stinger requires you to be in first person to use it. It's also not a particularly deep fight mechanically, requiring you to stand still and aim, but just takes such a long time to finish that it ends up being more of a test of endurance and patience than it does a test of any skill at the game. Immediately after this we get the rematch against Sniper Wolf, which is more or less note for note the same as the first fight. There's nothing wrong with that first fight, but did we really have to do it again? Was this idea worth repeating so soon after we did it the first time? At least the Vulcan Raven rematch came a decent chunk of time later, but if you take out the cutscenes, this rematch takes place maybe half an hour after the first fight, and I just don't think it needed to be here. Speaking of Vulcan Raven, we can finally move on to him, and I really like how I had to keep changing up my tactics for this fight as he kept finding ways to stop me using the same method over and over again. I used Nikita rockets, FAMAS, grenades, C4, more or less my entire arsenal as he seemed to adapt to what I was doing. Again, my only complaint is how long the fight dragged on, as sometimes he wouldn't even come near me for almost minutes at a time. Metal Gear Rex was a good fight against a machine that towered above me. Occasionally fights against foes this massive can turn into unfair, unavoidable damage as the enemy is so big that you can't see the attacks coming from off screen. Luckily Rex has several attacks, all of which the camera pulls right back for so that you can see them well ahead of time. It's like a much better version of the Hind fight as Rex moves slow enough to give the player time to aim the rocket launcher to hit the target they want rather than being happy with whatever they can get, and I found this to be the most satisfying vehicle fight in the game. And the final fight is Liquid Snake. This is basically just the Grey Fox fight from earlier, but with a smaller arena as you battle on top of the now destroyed Rex. The same problem crops up of you needing to practically be on top of the boss to be able to hit them with your whole combo, but overall this fight is more about what it represents in the narrative rather than being a mechanically deeper, intense encounter. There are other fights that are deeper, look at Vulcan Raven, or fights that are more fun, look at Mantis, but this one is intense because of the context of it being the final fight between two of the clones of the world's greatest soldier to see who comes out on top, and in that regard, I think it's very well done and a great finale to the previous fights across the entire game. So the question I find myself asking is, why do people hate this game so much? I've seen this called the worst remake ever made, or a bastardized version of the story of Metal Gear Solid, but personally, I don't see it. It's extremely faithful, changing minimal details about the story or characters, and rips 99% of its design verbatim from the PS1 game. I would say it's easier than the original, but that's not surprising given that this game has some serious improvements that I think make it a way smoother experience and a more enjoyable one when compared to the extremely limited options presented to us in Snake's first outing. The main problem I have with Twin Snakes is its availability. Physical copies are pretty pricey on the used market, and emulating doesn't give you the full experience the way it was intended, with reading the back of the case or changing the physical port your controller's plugged into. I wish Konami would re-release it, possibly in another master collection along with MGS4. Please, Konami, make your games fucking available instead of leaving them to die on old consoles. The thing that actually astonished me the most was just how little of your time playing the Twin Snakes is spent in the core gameplay loop of sneaking around and taking out guards. Most of your time is either spent watching cutscenes or partaking in set pieces and boss fights. But apart from the availability and my small handful of complaints, I fucking love the Twin Snakes. It's campy, it's dumb, it's so overdramatic, but that's Metal Gear, baby. And if you get a chance to play the Twin Snakes, I can highly recommend it. So, not only have we made it to the end of this video, but we've also made it to the end of 2024. I would say that personally, this year has been not great for me. There's been a lot of stuff going on, but in terms of the channel, I don't think we've had a better year than we have this year. I'm a lot happier with more of the output from this year. You know, looking back at what I've made, the Arkham Origins stuff in Gotham Knights was a good start. Bioshock, I think, is one of the best videos I've ever made. Crash Bandicoot was good. And also, you know, I got to talk about Metal Gear Solid quite a bit this year. I mean, hell, there was 2 months in a row where I spoke about MGS2. And don't get me wrong, while I'm happy with most of that video, I think it was a little bit bloated. So sort of everything after July with games lost to time I think is a lot better. And I'm definitely happier with my writing and everything like that this year. My presentation I think is a bit better. And I think that's because I'm allowing myself a little bit more time to work on the videos rather than them just being sort of shat out. But yeah, it's been a hell of a year. I got to collaborate with some people this year. I was collaborating with the Imperial Academy a couple times, and I got to collaborate with Jen Just Jen, who did a little bit of voice work in the Kratos video and that I've streamed with a couple times. But yeah, I've had a pretty good year. I took a little bit more time to focus on stuff away from YouTube. which is why I had to slow down the output, because it wasn't going to happen if I wanted to have a proper social life, and I'm getting to the end of my studies and having to go into work and stuff like that. So that's been a whole minefield, given that I'm self-employed. There's been a lot of stuff going on this year that could have potentially slowed down these videos, but I've managed to keep to one video a month for the whole year, and I think that's how I'm going to keep going. If I was going to set myself any goals for next year in terms of the channel, I would probably want to try and collaborate more, and I would want to push my videos a little further. Maybe even potentially pushing them beyond one video a month and just doing one video whenever it's bloody done. I don't know, I feel like that might slow down my output too much. Maybe a video every 2 months, every 3 months, something like that, and just make the videos better. But at the minute, one video a month is how I'm going to keep going, because that's been working for me and it seems to be doing well. But I'm going to let you all go now. I hope you have a very happy holidays and a happy new year. See you later.